Darktide is a fast and brutal co-op shooter that sees you and your squad thrown headfirst into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium in order to combat some of the most grotesque and hideous monstrosities that humanity has ever encountered. And as unforgiving as this game's universe is, the weaponry that the faithful servants of the God Emperor have been equipped with is equally savage, and makes butchering our way through unending hordes of heretics unbelievably satisfying. But did you know that the lore behind a lot of these weapons is actually really fascinating? From the quick little references to historic planets that we get in each of their unique names, to the story-specific mechanics of how some of the more esoteric weaponry actually functions. The developers over at Fat Shark were nice enough to reach out to my channel in order to sponsor a lore video. So today we're going to be deep diving the lore behind the melee weapons that are available in-game. If you haven't already downloaded Darktide, it's now available on Steam, and they actually just rolled out with their biggest update yet, patch 1.0.2, which includes a brand new map, the Signal, 2 new melee weapons, the ability to host private games, and the new refining crafting feature, as well as a bunch of balance updates and some bug fixes. So big thanks to Fat Shark for sponsoring this video. And I think the best place to start this video off with is by examining some of the more simple weapons that can be found in Darktide. And when I say simple weapons, I'm talking about the ones that don't utilize any kind of motor, energy field, or psionic amplification device. And the simplest of simple weapons would have to be the Ogryn Bully Clubs, as they're basically just a collection of jagged and heavy scrap metal that has been welded together in the shape of a club. A bashing weapon like this is certainly effective in melee, as any kind of club acts like a force amplifier, in that the longer it is, the more kinetic energy it can generate when swung. Combine that generated energy with the monstrous strength of an Ogryn, and you have a deadly, albeit not very elegant weapon, tailor-made for cracking skulls and mashing heretics into wet pulp. Ogryn weapons need to be simple and durable, as being gentle and restrained is not something an Ogryn is normally capable of. Refined weaponry with lots of buttons, or something that requires intense training to wield, would most likely just frustrate an Ogryn, and thus in turn be used to bash and smash anyways. It's why the grenade launcher has to be strapped to their arm, and their rivet guns have burst limiters put on them. Melee weapons wielded by Ogryns have to be big and ridiculously durable in order to withstand the brutal abuse that they will take in their hands. Because of this, they are often too large and unwieldy to be wielded by normal humans. If Darktide is your first introduction to the world of Warhammer 40,000, you may find yourself asking, why on earth would a trained fighter bring a shovel into battle? And I honestly don't mean this to be an insult, but 40K veterans, especially fans of the Kriegsmen, probably find that adorable. The tactical shovel is a remarkable tool, not just because of its bladed edge that makes it a deadly trench warfare weapon, but also in the fact that it has a wide array of practical uses outside of combat. Shovels like this are often standard issue equipment for guardsmen regiments that are likely to be deployed into battles that will heavily rely on trench warfare. Shovels with bladed edges like this double not just as a weapon, but as a multi-purpose tool, effective in the digging of trenches, chopping wood, cutting rope, or just about anything else one would need a shovel, axe, blade, or hammer for. Darktide has 2 different shovel weapons in the game, the Brute Brainer Mark III latrine shovel that is wielded by the Ogryns, a name that references the fact that Ogryns oftentimes do the dirty jobs that others don't want to do, as they're not normally the type to complain, and the standard issue Munitorum Sapper shovel, wielded by the veteran sharpshooters. Shovels like this are definitely widely used within the forces of the Astra Militarum, although they do have a bit of a reputation as a meme weapon, an inside joke amongst the Warhammer 40K community, as although fighting with a shovel is something that a guardsman would be trained in, it's not quite as widespread as some of our community's memes would have you believe. And 9 times out of 10, a guardsman will have a more effective weapon on hand, like their trusty bayonets or combat blades. Now that being said, the 40K dork that lives in my heart is pretty happy to see that the shovels were included in the game nonetheless. In the same vein as the shovels being effective and cheap to produce, we have things like the Aatrox tactical axes, each of which being derived from the designs of ancient hunting weapons that are effective in the hands of trained warriors. Axes, hammers, knives, sticks, and stones, these are the weapons of humble working folk, turned into standard issue gear for many strike teams under the Order of the Inquisition. Unfortunately, the lore behind these weapons is pretty scarce, and the only reference I could find to the planet they get their name from was on a single card from the Warhammer 40,000 card game Conquest. I'm sure this planet will play an important role in the future of 40k lore, but for now it remains pretty mysterious, though judging by the artwork, we can assume that it is a fortress world. It's also possible that the name could be a reference to Legio Atrox, a loyalist Titan legion that famously fought against the Night Lords during the Thramas Crusade. Combat axes are very similar to tactical axes, but are often issued to planetary defenders during trench warfare. Much like the standard issue shovels, they are versatile and effective in and outside of combat. The Achilles pattern combat axe most likely derives its name from an escort pattern ship that was used to transport civilians during the Great Crusade, and was later famously repurposed during the Horus Heresy to transport a fighting force of Imperial Knights to the planet of Malkanar in order to stop a Chaos Sorcerer ritual. These events were detailed in the short story Eater of Dreams. The other pattern of combat axe within Darktide is known as the Antax, and the Antax axes most likely derive their name from the Imperial Forge world located in the Eastern Fringe. At one point in this planet's history, it was taken over by orcs. Refusing to lose such a valuable world, and not to leave such an insult from a Xenos species unanswered, the Mechanicus mobilized a strike force to war against them. They took the planet back in an event that would later be known as the Battle for Antax, which unfortunately has had most of its records mysteriously disappear, so we really don't know too much about this particular point in time. When it comes to the swords in Darktide, there are a few different varieties, from the elegant Maccabian Dueling swords, the Catachan's Devilclaw swords, and the Turtolsky heavy swords. The Catachan swords are famously utilized by the Astra Militarum regiment of the same name, the Catachan Jungle Fighters. These people come from the death world of Catachan, a world that is overrun with thick and dangerous jungles, each of which being a home to thousands of deadly plant and animal species. The Mark I version is referred to as a knife by the Catachans, even though any other person who would look at its ridiculous length would call it a sword. The Devil Claw part of their name is a reference to a fearsome jungle predator known as a Catachan Devil, a massive scorpion-like creature that can reach lengths of up to 30 meters. The latest version of the Devil Claw swords actually have their blade hollowed out and filled with mercury. This makes them surprisingly lightweight while also giving the blade greater swinging power. Now on to something a bit more elegant. The Maccabian Dueling swords can trace their origins back to the world of Maccabius Quintus, a cold and bitter planet deep within the Calexis sector. They are wielded by what are known as Maccabian Janissaries, a deeply spiritual fighting force of the Astra Militarum, known for its unflinching loyalty to the God Emperor. The world they come from is not valued for its resources, as they don't really have that many to speak of, but instead, the planet seems to generate faith in an almost unnatural abundance, making the planet a potent shrine world that sees countless pilgrims flock to it each and every year. The Janissaries wear silver masks in the shape of Saint Drusius, a living saint that all of them have sworn to follow in the footsteps of. Once a member of this world becomes a full-fledged Janissary, they shall never return, instead spending the rest of their lives spreading the Emperor's light to the dark corners of the galaxy, defending his faithful from the alien, the mutant, and the heretic, until the fateful day that they are finally killed in battle. Saint Drusius, formerly known as Lord General Militant Drusius, was said to be a consummate swordsman who wielded an ornate dueling sword, and it would make sense that those who follow in his footsteps would also be trained to wield similar weapons. These blades are renowned for their lightweight and keen edge, as well as ostentatious detailing, making them a favored weapon amongst naval commanders, rogue traders, and Lord Inquisitors alike. Most Imperial swords are meant to be simple and heavy affairs, designed to be effectively wielded by both veterans and raw recruits alike, the innate skill of the user not being a limiting factor in the weapon's lethality. This isn't the case with the Maccabian Dueling swords, as they require years of practice in order to master. The Turtolsky heavy swords can trace their origins to the moon of Turtolsky, which orbits the industrial world of Vostroya. This is famously the home of the Vostroyan firstborn of the Astra Militarum, and my personal favorite guard regiment. Turtolsky and Vostroya are both massive industrial centers that provide weapons and armor to the Imperial war machine. The Vostroyans have always been loyal to the Emperor and his Imperium, but thousands of years ago during the Horus Heresy, all loyalist worlds were called upon to send large portions of their population to fight against the traitors. Vostroya refused, arguing that as a manufacturing world, they would better serve the Imperium by continuing to produce weapons and armaments, something they wouldn't be able to do as effectively if they gave away such a huge portion of their population. Although refusing the call to service is normally met with swift punishment by the Imperium, Vostroya was shown a rare act of mercy. Nevertheless, the descendants of these people would forever feel a deep shame over their ancestors' refusal to answer the call, and nowadays seek to atone for their perceived cowardice by sending the firstborn of every family to fight in the Astra Militarum. What's pretty interesting about the Firstborn recruits is that they will be sent out to reinforce existing units of Ostroyan that they have familial ties with, rather than just forming new units. This means that each and every regiment can trace their lineage back thousands of years. The new recruits will often be fighting side by side with distant cousins, aunts, and uncles, who will then in turn spread their wisdom and experience to their younger family members. This means that the bonds of brotherhood are stronger amongst the Vostroyan Firstborn than pretty much any other guard regiment. The Vostroyan Firstborn are an incredibly rugged people that were trained to fight in the frigid landscapes of their homeworld. It makes sense that the swords that were designed for them would also take on such characteristics. They are thick and heavy blades, capable of delivering punishing blows to masked foes, cleaving through aliens and heretics alike with relative ease. Though admittedly they do struggle with poor armor penetration when fighting against elites. This doesn't change the fact that they are incredibly effective, and their design has become popular amongst naval crews as well as some rogue traders. So now that we understand the origins and history of some of the weapons in Darktide that look a bit more familiar to us, let's talk a bit more about some of the more esoteric weapons that can be found in-game. There's nothing that really screams Warhammer 40K to me quite like its iconic chain weaponry. These can take the form of chain swords, chain axes, polearms, glaives, scythes, and just about any other melee weapon that you can think of. If it's an edged weapon that exists in the grimdark future, there's probably a chain version of it. In its simplest form, a chain weapon is a type of melee weapon that uses a motorized chain of serrated teeth that are used to hack, saw, and massacre their way through enemy hordes. Possibly even more diverse than the sheer number of different patterns of chain weapons that exist, or the varied ways in which they are built, many of which are very straightforward and are based on technology that was developed during our time, whereas others utilize monomolecular teeth that make them inconceivably sharp. Some chain weapons like the Eviscerator that the Zealot class has access to even utilize a small, weak power field that further enhances its cutting capability, but we'll cover power weapons in a minute. It's interesting to note that although most commonly associated with the forces of humanity, a chain weaponry is something that is quite popular amongst many different factions across the galaxy. The Eldar famously utilize their own versions of chain weapons, like the Scorpion chainswords wielded by the Striking Scorpions. The fan-favorite faction of the Orcs can also commonly be seen wielding chain weapons, such as with their chain choppas and their larger cousins, the huge chain choppas. They're brutal weapons that make a lot of noise, so it's everything that the Orcs love. Now, different human factions are commonly associated with different chain weapons. For example, the reason the Eviscerator sword is exclusive to the Zealots has its roots in the deeper lore. The Eviscerator is a larger two-handed chainsword, used almost exclusively by the members of the Ministorum, also known as the Ecclesiarchy. You can think of them like the state church of the Imperium. They're commonly equipped by the church's military forces known as the Sisters of Battle, with a particular unit known as the Repentia, a Sister of Battle who has for some reason either failed in the line of duty or had a major lapse in faith. In order to make amends and right her misdoings, whether they're literal or perceived only by them, these women will be stripped of their armor and have their guns taken away from them. They will then be handed an Eviscerator and sent charging into the enemy ranks, like a holy barbarian set loose to unleash righteous butchery in the God Emperor's name, his divine protection being the only form of armor that they will receive. Chain axes are most commonly associated with a traitor legion known as the World Eaters, but this doesn't mean that there aren't also defenders of mankind that use them as well. Imperium chain axes are commonly associated with the Space Marine legion known as the Space Wolves, of which the teeth of their version is actually made from the teeth of a kraken, mighty beasts that live on their homeworld of Fenris, and are normally hunted as part of the Trial of Morkai, a trial that an aspirant will be forced to undertake in order to graduate into the ranks of the Space Wolves. Chainswords are the most common variety of chain weapon, and are wielded not only by the forces of the Space Marines, but also by members of the Astra Militarum as well. They are absolutely brutal and horrific weapons to face in battle, and not just for their effectiveness in hacking apart heretics, but also in the effects they have on enemy morale. Hearing hundreds of chainswords roar to life on the battlefield is absolutely terrifying, and can break many formations before the charging soldiers even crash into their ranks, as the anticipation of the butchery to come proves to be too much for the undisciplined mobs of the heretics. Not to mention the demoralizing effect of seeing one of your comrades hacked apart by one of these things has a devastating impact on the soldier's psychology. There is nothing graceful about chain weapons. They are loud, brutal, and messy, sending showers of gore, bone splinters, and armor shrapnel high into the air with every swing. An entire regiment equipped with them leaves piles of dismembered corpses and a cascading haze of red mist in their wake. As of the time of recording this video, we haven't got all of those esoteric chain weapons in the game yet, But I know I'm personally hoping that they add a chain scythe later on down the road, because I can only imagine how ridiculous its cleaving stat would be. Whereas chain weaponry is pretty simple to make and can be easily mass-produced, power weapons are exceedingly rare, and most of the ones in service are hundreds if not thousands of years old, having been passed from wielder to wielder. To own such a weapon, let alone carry it into battle, is a massive symbol of prestige and honor, normally reserved for high-ranking military commanders or Space Marine veterans. There are very few members of the Mechanicus left in existence that have the necessary knowledge in order to craft them, and if such an artisan actually exists, they may not have the resources at their disposal in order to put one together, making each and every power weapon not only legendary, but exceedingly rare and inconceivably valuable. There are a lot of different types of power weapons, like the power swords or the thunderhammers that we see in Darktide. And much like the chain weapons, pretty much any weapon that you can think of could be theoretically made into a power weapon version, if the correct technology is applied to it. The way they work is similar from power weapon to power weapon, but their effect in battle can be pretty different depending on what type of weapon it is. Edged weapons, like power swords, have the ability to toggle on a power field, which, when activated, sheathes the blade in a crackling corona of electrified blue energy. The power field is actually what is known as a matter disruption field, meaning the energy field severs the molecular bonds of anything it makes contact with, rending the target apart at a molecular level. This makes these swords unbelievably sharp, and they're able to cut through just about anything with relative ease, whether that be the thick, heavy armor of an enemy vehicle or the torsos of charging heretics. Now, blunt power weapons are built in a similar way, but they utilize their power fields pretty differently. They instead store the energy they produce, rather than just having it constantly leaking out of the blade. At the moment the head of the weapon makes impact, all of that stored energy is released in a huge concussive explosion that leaves massive craters in the sides of tanks, or exploding heretics into a pulpy shower of gore. Many types of blunt power weapons like this actually have the ability to have their power generation cranked up or down. Weapons like the Crozius, wielded by Space Marine chaplains, can regulate their power to either absolutely destroy whatever they swing at, or lower it just enough to deliver a knockout blow. This gives the wielder the ability to conserve energy. You could make the argument that most of the weapons on this list could be effectively wielded by just about anybody, so long as they had enough training or upper body strength. Force weapons are the exception, as they are completely useless in the hands of anyone but a psyker. You see, force weapons act like a conduit, a channeling device in which a psyker can funnel the powers of the warp from their own body and into the enemy target. This gives the psyker the ability to refine and direct their energy much more precisely, rather than just having to turn on the flow of warp energy and barely control it. You can think of it like this: a psyker without such a device is just opening and closing a valve. With training, they can direct the flow, but it's still difficult to control, let alone refine, whereas a force weapon gives them much greater control over this energy and how it will manifest. It's like taking a fire hose and refining it into a precision water cutter. Most force weapons were originally tailor-made for a specific psyker. They have intricate patterns designed into the surface of the weapon that serpentine across its surface. Each of these patterns acts as a funnel for the user's psychic energy, and each one is completely different from the next, dependent upon the psyker in which the weapon was designed for. Even when made to the exact specifications of the psyker, becoming attuned to such a device is incredibly difficult, a task that becomes even harder when that weapon inevitably ends up getting passed down to a new wielder. It's not to say that a normal person couldn't wield something like a force sword, as they definitely could. It's not going to explode in their hands or anything like that. But force weapons draw their remarkable abilities from a psyker's mind, not from some kind of techno-arcane device embedded in the hilt like with a power weapon. So to those not gifted with psychic abilities, these ancient and powerful devices will be little more than a simple blade. However, there have been some accounts of psykers lending their weapons to their allies, and still being able to channel their powers through them from a distance, which opens up some pretty interesting tactical applications. As time goes on, I'm sure we're going to be getting a lot of new melee weapons to play with in Darktide, but if you're familiar with Warhammer 40K, what are some of the most iconic ones that you'd love to see get added to the game? Even if you're brand new to 40K, what are some of your favorite weapons from other games that you think would be a great fit in the hands of our player characters? What's your favorite weapon on this list? Are you more of a sword, axe, or hammer person? Or are you a true soldier of the Imperium, and you have unquestionable loyalty to the good old-fashioned shovel? Thanks again to the developers over at Fatshark for sponsoring this lore video, and thank you to all you viewers for watching the video all the way through. The watch time combined with liking and subscribing helps out the channel a lot. And if you like content like this, go ahead and subscribe for more, as there's so much more about the 40K universe I'd love to tell you about. Thanks again, everybody, and with all that out of the way, I'll catch y'all on the next one.